Evening to everybody. My name is Nino Luraghi. I teach Greek history at Oxford, and I'm a senior fellow of the Turin Humanities program. I have the pleasure of welcoming you in name of the Turin Humanities program and of the Foundation 1563, which supports it, to the talk tonight. Our guest, Professor Myles Lavan from the University of St. Andrews, is a specialist in Roman imperial history. His first book from 2013 may seem to bear a close connection to his talk tonight. It does only if you limit yourself to the title. It's called Slaves to Rome, but it's in fact an investigation of the language of Roman imperialism and the ways in which other relations of hierarchy, like the one between enslavers and enslaved, were mobilized within this language. Professor Lavan is well known among ancient historians for having chastised them, for having advocated for explicit use of quantification, responsible quantification in ancient history, and for embracing statistical approaches when such quantification is appropriate and needed. His talk tonight has relations to both his previous areas of work, but has been moving in a different direction. This is part of an ongoing project on enslavement and manumission in the Roman imperial world, and approach with a comparative angle, looking at similar comparable phenomena in transatlantic slavery. His talk tonight, as you see, is entitled Trafficking Enslaved People to Rome, New Evidence from the Epitaphs. Myles, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Nino. And thanks very much to the program and to the Foundation for the invitation. It's such a pleasure to be here in Turin, beginning of the year. And thanks very much to all the Italian colleagues for having the patience to come here and listen to me in English. Don't hesitate to signal if at any point my excitement gets me carried away and I speak a little bit too fast. And I'll also apologize for the fact that there are numbers in this talk, right, as Nino will have alluded to. I mean, I know numbers aren't to everybody's taste, but I think there are some questions in history that are fundamentally quantitative and where we can't make progress without numbers. And so what I'll just endeavor to do is to be as straightforward and clear as possible when I do talk about numbers. So an interest I share with the cycle that Nino and the team are working on here is the nexus between slavery, origins, and otherness, both in antiquity and in other periods. And I think one can't think about those issues for very long without coming up against the empirical question of where enslaved people in different populations came from. Right, and what proportion of enslaved populations were trafficked from abroad. And that's an empirical question that in some ways sort of sits alongside some of the more cultural historical questions that the cycle is interested in, but I think it's an important one. And so that's what I would like to grapple with today. And I'd like to try to address it for what must have been the largest urban enslaved population in history. Right, the enslaved population of the city of Rome in the late Republic and early Empire. Now, those who think about numbers, which currently tends to be, I think, mostly Anglophone ancient history, right? If you don't like quantification, you might think of quantification as an Anglophone disease, right? In that there's a lot of it, or it's concentrated, I think, in Anglophone history. And those who do think about numbers or talk explicitly about numbers, have moved in the direction that I've called the new minimalism, which is owed above all to the influence of one particularly prolific, brilliant, and influential ancient historian called Walter Scheidel, who's done a lot to advance quantification and demographic approaches in history. And Walter has published a series of provocative articles that questioned then prevailing assumptions about the scale of slavery in Italy, and also about the extent to which the Italian slave system depended on external sources of slaving. And there's two articles that were particularly influential. The first one in 2005 used demographic modeling to try to estimate from first principles how many enslaved people would have been necessary to serve the market for the kinds of goods that people thought enslaved people were working on. So producing wine for urban markets, or olive oil for urban markets. And he suggested that there is no way that the markets that existed could have supported an enslaved population that would be more than 20% of the population of Italy, which is much lower than people had thought before. And then a second important article in 97 questioned the prevailing wisdom that the Roman slave system depended massively on the capture of foreign people in war or on slaving. And he insisted that natural reproduction must have been the most important source of enslaved people in the Roman world. He insisted that external sources could not have made up more than 25% of the population of the empire. And he did so again through a demographic model. He tried to estimate what the population of the periphery of the empire would have been and thought about just how many people could have been taken from that population sustainably on an annual basis, and thought that it couldn't be more than 25%. Now, I'll just say two things about those articles. The first is I think they're very clever, right? And I think they opened up a hitherto unused sort of avenue of analysis. But I think they should have been seen as the first word on these subjects. And they should have been followed by other articles that sort of tested the ideas, challenged them, and sought to advance them. But unfortunately, what happened, because the skills that Walter used are so sort of scarcely distributed in the field, is that nobody has followed up on these, right? And what should have been the first word on the subject has ended up being the last word. Now, I think both these articles open up the right avenue of inquiry, but I don't think their results are conclusive. So I personally haven't persuaded of those two results, though I think it should be possible to improve on them by spending some more time pursuing the same channel of thought. So that's the first observation. That's me personally, I'm not convinced. But even if you agreed with Walter on both these points, those arguments are made about the population of Italy as a whole or the population of the empire as a whole. They don't necessarily have any clear implications for the city of Rome, right, which is only a small part of the empire and which must have represented a massive concentration of wealth in the empire. So Walter himself, even though he thought that only 20% of the population of Italy could have been enslaved, he thought slavery operated on a larger scale in the cities, right? So he thought those proportions would be higher in cities, and they could have been even higher in the city of Rome, the largest and wealthiest city within Italy. And similarly, his argument about the extent to which the system kind of relied on slaving and captives is an argument at the level of the empire as a whole. There's absolutely no reason why a city with a concentration of wealth like the city of Rome might not have relied to a much larger extent than this. That said, his ideas have been very influential. And I think for those people who think in these terms, it has become conventional to adopt this position that I've described as the new minimalism. And so to illustrate this here, I've just cited a very good book on mobility in the Roman Empire, specifically the city of Rome, written by Renz Takema. Now, this book was necessarily a work of synthesis. He was bringing together lots of things people had written about different topics to try to understand different forms of mobility in the city of Rome and how they played out. And I think that's useful precisely because it's a work of synthesis. I think Takema gives a very good representation of where the state of play is or what people think at the moment. And so in this book, he builds a model of the urban population of the city of Rome and where it came from. And among his assumptions are that the enslaved make up just 20 to 30% of the population of the city, and that only 15 to 30% of them were not born in the city of Rome. So he thinks that most of the enslaved population were enslaved at birth in the city of Rome. Now, I think if both those claims were true, it would have quite significant implications for the nexus of slavery, origins, and otherness that we're all interested in. But I personally don't think they are. I think the scale of slavery was much larger than this suggests. And I also think that the Roman slave population was much more dependent on trafficking from abroad than this suggests. Now, I won't have time today to talk about both aspects. So what I want to do is to focus on this second one. So I want to focus on the now conventional idea that the Roman slave system in general, and the city of Rome in particular, relied mostly on natural reproduction to reproduce the enslaved population. Now, Walter Scheidel's ideas, they weren't based on evidence. They were based on demographic modeling and first principles. So I think it is worth stopping for a moment and asking ourselves what evidence there is for the population of the city of Rome. And the answer is that the most important evidence we have is the absolutely massive corpus of epitaphs that come from the city of Rome. A very heterogeneous corpus, because they come from all sorts of different monuments, and most of them have been completely divorced from their archaeological context, right, and only survive in corpora like this. Nonetheless, there's a truly massive number. All right, so the CIL alone has around 30,000 epitaphs that are conventionally seen as representative of the general population of Rome. That's after excluding epitaphs of emperors in the imperial family, senators, equestrians, and soldiers. And because of the format of Roman epitaphs, which often have both a dedicator and the commemorated, those 30,000 epitaphs name around 50,000 people who would have lived in the city of Rome. And these epitaphs are mostly from the first 2 centuries AD, the early empire. So what we have are the names and epitaphs associated with about 50,000 people from the city of Rome. I don't want to go into great detail about the composition of these epitaphs, other than to say that it is clear that the epitaphs cannot be representative of the total population of the city. Anyone who's done any work on the Roman epitaphs will know that some, but only a minority of Roman epitaphs, reveal the status of the person who's named. Because when Romans named themselves in full, they would indicate whether they were free or enslaved. And if they were free, they would indicate whether they were freeborn, because they would be described as the son of their father, or whether they were freed, in which case they would be the libertus or their patronus. But as you can see from the numbers in the top left, only slightly more than 30% of the people who are named in such a way that allows us to be absolutely certain that they were either freeborn, freed, or enslaved. And about 70% are named in a way that leaves their status uncertain. And these people are often called the incerti, the uncertain, by social historians working on this material. Now, that said, it's worth noting, though it's often neglected, that almost all the people whose status are uncertain are named in a way, that is, they're given the dua or trianomina, that reveal that they're free, right? So the uncertainty is whether they were freeborn or freed. These people cannot have been enslaved because they have the names of a Roman citizen and hence a free person. Now, it's not my main focus today, but I'll come back to why in a moment, but there are certain other indices we can use to distribute these uncertain people between the freeborn and the freed. And a lot of it has to do with the kind of name they have, which I'll come back to in a moment. But for the moment, I'm just going to suggest that this is how I see the distribution of the population. I think we can work out how the uncertain free divide between the freeborn and the freed. And I think that the freeborn make just about a quarter of the population that's represented in the epitaphs. Now, you may or may not think that's plausible, but what's certainly not plausible is this, right? That the enslaved are almost invisible in the Roman epitaphs. It seems clear to me that less than 10% of the people we see are enslaved, whereas around 70% are freed, right? And there is no way that is representative of the actual relationship between the enslaved and freed in the population. So it seems that there's no alternative to the conclusion that epitaphs or stone epitaphs as a particular social practice were dominated by the freed in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the empire. And so what we see through the epitaphs are mostly the freed population of the city. But that's still interesting in itself, because if I'm right about these numbers, given that there's about 50,000 people named on the epitaphs, we have the names of more than 30,000 people who had been enslaved, but were then freed, right, and died free in Rome, and maybe another 4,000 enslaved people, right? But we have approaching 40,000 people who lived at least some of their lives in slavery in the city of Rome. And I think we have an obligation to do what we can to use these epitaphs to reconstruct some of the history of these people, or to reconstruct some of the circumstances under which they lived their lives. So what might one do with epitaphs in terms of thinking of origins? There are some epitaphs that reveal where a person was born, like the epitaph on the left of this slide. So this is the epitaph of Caius Ducenius Phoebus. He's named in a way that reveals the fact that he's a freedman through what we call libertination. He's Gaius Ducenius Kai Libertus, the freedman of Caius Phoebus. So we know he's freed. In this case, we also know that he was born in Syria, in Nisibis, and then, he tells us, was eventually manumitted in Rome. So we know here is a man who was enslaved, then freed, and was certainly not born in Rome, right, but had been brought to Rome from the east. These are fascinating, but there are very, very few of them. So first Martin Bang, and then later Heikki Solin, combed through all the inscriptions in CIL, and later Heikki Solin combed through all the inscriptions published later, and together they found just 132 cases where we know somebody was freed or enslaved, and where they're named with an origin outside the city of Rome. Yeah, that is a tiny number in comparison with the 14,000 or so people who were certainly freed or enslaved. And not even Walter Scheibel would imagine that the extent to which the Roman system depended on slaving was 1% or less. The only answer has to be that origin was just something that was very rarely mentioned in the epitaphs. And that in a handful of cases, we learn that somebody was originated outside Rome, but that's the exception. And we can't assume that because somebody doesn't have an origin, that they were born in Rome. So unfortunately, the origins, or just explicit statements of origin, are just too rare for us to be able to do very much with in terms of answering the question of where these people came from. But there is a different angle that one can take. And this is to look at the names in the epitaphs. Anyone who's worked on the epitaphs of the city of Rome will have been struck very early on by what a large proportion of the people named in them have a name that's Greek in origin rather than Latin. So the three people named in these epitaphs all have the tria or duonomina of Roman citizens or free people. So the son is Caius Pomponius Romanus, his parents are Caius Pomponius Crathus, and his mother is Pomponia Eurynome. But Crathus and Eurynome are both Greek names, which are functioning here as the cognomina or third names of Roman citizens. And only Romanus has a Latin name. And so it is obvious to anyone who sort of pages or leafs through the pages of CIL, and it's been obvious to a long time for social historians. So my estimate is that about 56% of all the personal names of the 50,000 people in CIL are non-Latin. And most of them are Greek, right? There are a small number of names that have other linguistic origins, like it might be Persian or Hebrew. Now, to my knowledge, the first person to make that observation and to bring it into the service of social history was Tenny Frank, who was one of the leading American historians of Rome in the early 20th century. And he made some observations about this in an article that is kind of notable both for its misguided empiricism and kind of for its odious race politics. So he noticed how widespread these Greek names were. He assumed, and so this first point, he assumed that the presence of a Greek name in a family was evidence that that family was of servile or foreign stock. So he thought one could go through the pages of CIL, and anytime one saw an epitaph where one member of a family had a Greek name, you could say, aha, this family is descended from slaves and from foreign stock. He then came to the conclusion that nearly 90% of the people he thought were born in Rome, represented in the sepulchral inscriptions, were of foreign extraction. He thought that this meant that the native stock of Rome had essentially died out, which he described as race suicide, which was echoing kind of a term that was something that the Protestant elite of the US were worried about at the time. Interestingly, he suggests that like the practice of abortion might have been one of the reasons why the native stock in Rome allowed itself to go extinct. But for him, this explained why the people who built Rome had given way to a different race. And this then explained what seemed to him the clear cultural sort of political decline of the Roman population in the imperial period. So he thought the prevalence of Greek names in these Latin epitaphs proved sort of a change in the racial makeup of Rome that explained the eventual decline of Roman society. Now, not only the empiricism, but like clearly the race politics to which it's yoked in this are kind of transparent to us now. But I wanted to start with the empirical point. He was clearly mistaken in assuming that a name was in itself an indication of origin. And the first person to demonstrate this was Heike Solin, who's done a huge amount of work on the onomastics of the Roman population. Now, he was one of the people who had collected all the evidence of people who certainly originated outside Rome. And he looked at the distribution of names, Latin or non-Latin, among that group. And as he was able to show that in the small group of people who we know weren't born in Rome, but came from the Western provinces, 40% of those have a Greek name. Right? So it's clearly not the case that having a Greek name proves you came from the East. Lots of people born in Rome or originating in the Western provinces also have Greek names. Right? So he said, you cannot do what Tenny Frank had tried to do and take names as an index of origin. Now, since then, people have taken names in a different direction. So Tenny Frank tried to treat names as an index of origin. Nowadays, what people do is use a name as an index of legal status. And this comes from a different observation. You'll remember that some of the people who appear in the epitaphs have a status that is certain, right? Because they're named in a way that makes clear that they were freeborn or makes clear that they were freed. And if you look at those groups, you can see a striking difference in the distribution of Greek or non-Latin names between those groups. So among the people who we know were certainly freeborn, only about 20% have a name that's not Latin in origin. Whereas among those who are certainly freed, the proportion is 70%. So freed people are much more likely to have a non-Latin name than were freeborn people. Heike Solin observed this, and so too about a decade before had Lily Ross Taylor, right? And they both used this observation, then looked at the proportion of Greek names in the epitaphs, and they were the first to intuit that the epitaphs must be dominated by the freed. But I say intuit because the logic they used was faulty. I think they drew the right conclusion, but for the wrong reasons. So they thought that looking at this, the next step would be to say, aha, okay, if this is true, we can assume that anybody who has a non-Latin name is freed rather than freeborn, because these names are more common among the freed than the freeborn. And that's logically flawed. Now, this isn't my main focus for the moment, but it'll help a little bit with what I want to come back to. So I'm going to make this point briefly. And I think the easiest way to understand it is to imagine two extreme scenarios. Imagine you encountered a population in the city of Rome that was composed entirely of freeborn people of ingenui, right? So we would know there would be no freedmen in that group. We're imagining a group that's composed entirely of the freeborn. But some of those people would still have non-Latin names, right? Because we know that 20% of the freeborn had non-Latin names. And in that case, none of the people who have a non-Latin name would be freed, right? So actually, the assumption that people who have one of these names as freed would be wrong. Conversely, if you imagined a population in which everyone was freed, then you'd expect about 70% of those to have a non-Latin name. And of course, in that case, everyone who has a non-Latin name would indeed be freed, but so too would those who have a Latin name. And then if you imagine some mixture of the freed and freeborn, the proportion of freedmen will be somewhere between 0 and 100%. And then the proportion of non-Latin names will be somewhere between the 23% and the 70%. So if you think about it that way, you'll realize that it's the proportion of non-Latin names that provides a kind of yardstick, that it gives us a sense of the prevalence of freed people in this mixture. So rather than making assumptions about individuals, you should just be looking at how the proportion varies between around 20% and around 70%. If you see a number around 20%, that means they're almost all freeborn. And you don't need to assume that some of them are free. And conversely, if you see a number around 70%, you should be assuming they're all freed, right? And you shouldn't just be focusing on those with Greek names. So I think this is the logical way to link names to status. But as it happens, in this case, it leads to roughly the same conclusions, right? So this too suggests that almost all the people, 56% happens to be the proportion we observe among the free incurti among the epitaphs. So the people who are certainly free, but whose status is uncertain. And so that suggests that about 76% of those were freed. Again, it suggests that most people in the epitaphs are freed. And so it's this far, it seems that Solin and Taylor were right, that names are an indication of status, but not origin, right? And I think this is where most social historians are now. But it turns out it's a little bit more complicated than that. And the first person to notice this was Christer Bruun, who wrote a very interesting paper just a little over a decade ago. And he noticed sort of an oddity. He was drawing on the work of Heikki Solin, who I mentioned before, who had done the exhaustive survey of the onomastics in the Roman epitaphs. And he noticed that Solin had calculated that if among freed and enslaved people in general, 70% of them had a non-Latin name, right? That's more or less consistent with the statistics I just showed you. But there are a small number of people in the epitaphs who are explicitly described as verni. Now, verna is the Latin term for a home-born slave. So when a slave owner commemorated a slave who died enslaved, they sometimes would dedicate it, there would be the name of the owner, then the name of the enslaved person, and then it would say, a master to his verna or to her verna. To make explicit that the person who was being commemorated had been born in the household of the slave owner. And sometimes we find the reverse. Sometimes a freed person might commemorate their patron, and you might be a freed person to their patron, and the freed person might describe themselves as the verna of their patron, as having been born in their household. So verna tells us that somebody was born in the household of the person who commemorated them or who they're commemorating. And de facto, it probably means that they're born in the city of Rome. We don't have very many of them, but what Bruun noticed is that non-Latin names were much rarer among the people who were certainly verni than among all the freed or enslaved. Right? So roughly, precisely 43% rather than 70%. And he thought that this disproved sort of Scheidel's claim. He thought if Scheidel was right, there is no way that if verni if portion was 43% among verni and verni were predominant, there's no way we'd see 70% in the total. Now, I would just say two things about that. First, Scheidel's point was about the empire as a whole, not about the city of Rome, right? It's perfectly possible that the city of Rome was highly dependent on trafficking from abroad, and yet the empire as a whole was not. But the second problem with this is the extraordinarily small number of people who are explicitly described as verni, right? Only about 600 out of sort of approaching 40,000 people who are probably enslaved or freed. We've no idea why, in particular cases, a slave owner or a patron might have described an enslaved person as a verna and not others. But it's given the extremely low numbers, it seems perfectly possible that it's an expression of favoritism in some kind, that only particular favorites were explicitly described as verni. And if that were true, one can easily imagine that part of being a favorite might also have been given a different kind of name, right? One might imagine that it's no accident that the people who are called verni also more of them happen to have Latin names than the others, right? So when I first read Bruun's article, I wasn't convinced, right, that this was a smoking gun, right, that proved Scheidel wrong for the city of Rome, precisely because there are just so few verni, right? And that there might be other factors that explain why the Verni look so different from everybody else. But in fact, it turns out there is even clearer evidence that suggests that Bruin was right, and that we can see it in the freed population as a whole. So this brings me to this slide, which is the core of my talk. So I'm going to take my time talking you through it, because I've convinced myself that it's quite important. So for other reasons, I was interested in looking at people in the epitaphs who had an age at death. Now, I mentioned that the epitaphs name about 50,000 people. Not all of those people are the deceased, because in Roman epitaphs, you often have the surviving kin name themselves as well. So only a fraction, I think it's something like 3/4 of the 50,000 people were actually deceased. And then only a fraction of those who were deceased are given an age at death, because that wasn't normal or universal in Roman epitaphs. But the fraction is significant. So I think of the 50,000 people, there are about 10,000 who have an age at death in the epitaphs. 10,000 is a very large number. So when I first did this analysis, to make things simpler, I focused on the people who had an age at death that was a multiple of 5. So I looked at people who died at age 5 or age 10 or age 15, which is like taking a random sample from the epitaphs. If there are any patterns in the epitaphs, you'll see it by looking at those numbers. And so this chart shows one of the things I observed. So roughly 10,000 people have an age at death, and of those, maybe 2,000 have an age at death that was a multiple of 5. Now, if you remember, only a small minority of people were certainly freed. So of those 2,000, maybe 300 people were certainly freed, have an age at death, and that age at death is a multiple of 5. And so this chart shows you the distribution of names among those people, but shows how it changes with age. So each black dot shows a group of people who died at the same age. So the first black dot shows, I think, roughly 20 people who were all certainly freed and died at age 5, and shows that something like 43% of them had a non-Latin name. The second dot shows you the people who were certainly freed and died at age 10, right, and shows that the proportion of non-Latin names is approximately the same. Now, what you'll see is that there's a surprising trend that non-Latin names become more common, right, the older a freed person was when they were died, right? So I hope you can see that visually from the black dots. You don't need to worry about the gray. The gray curve is just a statistical test to look for the trend, right? And that was just confirming for me that what I was seeing was not just something I was imposing on the data, but that non-Latin names do become more common with age. If you don't like the graph, you might just focus on the fact on the right, right? So we have roughly 60 people who died as children, right? So at 5, 10, or 15, and only 44% of them have a non-Latin name. And we have another 50 people who died in old age, but 83% of them have a non-Latin name, right? So almost twice as much. Now, I think this is quite an important chart. So at some point, I'm going to go back and expand this by looking at the other 8,000 odd people who have an age at death. But because of the way random samples work, it'll take me some time. It's not going to change this trend, right? The trend is still going to be upwards. But what I hope it will do is it will reduce the noisiness of the trend just by expanding this sample from about 300 people to about 1,000 people. But this is striking. This really surprised me and perplexed me when I first came across it. Because people don't change their names as they get older, right? Once you're freed, you keep your name for the rest of your life. And to underline the oddity of this, look at this chart, which does the same thing for the even smaller group of people who were certainly freeborn, right? Who are named in a way that shows that they were ingenui, right? They were born free. The sample is even smaller, 107, but it's clear from that there is no relationship between age and names, right? About 20% of freeborn people had a non-Latin name, and that's equally true of those who died young and those who died old. So the question is, why is it that non-Latin names become more common than the older freed people were when they died? Now, I think I know the answer, and I think that what's happening is that the the composition of this population is changing as the group gets older. So if you look at the first three, the freed people who die as children, right? These are people who maybe die at age 10 and have already been freed at that point. It must be the case for people who are freed in childhood that almost all of them had been enslaved at birth in the city of Rome, right? These aren't people who are being brought to Rome as like older children or adults, right? Because they're too young for it. So those people must be giving us a view on the population who were enslaved at birth in Rome. And as you see here, that's 44% of 56 people had a non-Latin name. That's interestingly almost exactly the same as the proportion that Heikki Solin found among people who are described as Verni, which you might remember, about 600 people, 43% of whom have a Latin name. Now, those are two completely independent samples. Like the Verni, many of them don't have an age at death at all, and those who do die at all sorts of ages. But we know they were born in the city of Rome, and about 43% of them have a non-Latin name. Here, we don't know that they're Verni, but we know that they died free so young, right, that they must have been born in the city of Rome. And they too, the proportion is 44%. So the two together convince me that that's indicative of onomastic patterns among the enslaved population that was born in the city of Rome. And I think of it as kind of like a fingerprint, right? It's clearly not the case that every slave owner in Rome gave their slave a Latin name or a non-Latin name. But there's just a particular pattern of names that's characteristic of the city of Rome and its enslaved population, right? And that's about something like 44% Latin and the rest Greek. So that explains why we get those numbers, those proportions in childhood, and why the first three dots are kind of flat. Now then what must be happening is as the freed people get older, there must be other people joining this population, right? We must be seeing a second group entering this population that has a different onomastic pattern in which non-Latin names are much more common. So I think these have to be the people from outside Rome who were not enslaved at birth at Rome, but were trafficked to Rome from abroad. And it would make sense that we would only start to see those in the freed population beginning in the early teens and the 20s, right? I mean, only the very privileged among them can already have been freed, right, by age 20 or 25, but it seems that a few were. Right? And as we get older, they're becoming more and more visible in the freed population. Now, it's also clear, right, that this proportion gets very, very high, right, by old age, right? So there have to be enough, the proportion of people who hadn't been born in Rome has to be large enough among the olds to have brought that average up from 40% to something like 80%, right? And so the proportion has to be really, really high. Now, the problem is we know the onomastic pattern of those born in Rome. We don't know the onomastic pattern of those who weren't. We just know it has to be different enough to move the needle to that extent. But you could consider one extreme case, which is to say, let's imagine that every single person who was trafficked to Rome as a child or adult had a non-Latin name, which is the extreme case. How many of them would we need to have to see the proportion of non-Latin names among the adults? And it'd be something like this. So if you assume that all of those trafficked from elsewhere have a non-Latin name, to see the proportions we see in old age, they would need to be making up about 2/3 of the freed population by old age. And that's an absolute minimum, right? If we allow for the fact that some of them had Latin names as well, it would have to be even higher. And you remember that this is only among the freed, right? So we're only seeing them when they become freed. If they're 2/3 of the older freed population, they must have been present in the enslaved population before. I think it's worth very briefly pausing in order to help to understand what we're seeing in the Roman case. Pausing and looking to a very different context. So I'm going here to Brazil, kind of at the beginning of the 18th century, because there's one parish in Brazil where an extraordinary document was compiled by the clergy, listing all people entitled to receive communion, which gives an extraordinary wealth of vital details. And to my knowledge, this is the single best documented enslaved population in history. And it's very useful for thinking through some of the complexities of enslaved populations, right, which look very different to natural populations because lots of the people in them hadn't been enslaved at birth. And so I think it's worth very briefly looking at this population to help us see what's going on in the Roman population. So this parish in Brazil, about 50% of the population were enslaved. And like a lot of Brazil, it's highly dependent upon the transatlantic slave trade. So 60% of the enslaved population was African captives. So people who had been born free in Africa had been captured there, trafficked across the Atlantic, and put to work in the parish. Now, manumission operated very differently among those who'd been enslaved at birth in Brazil and those who'd been brought to Brazil as captives. Unsurprisingly, manumission starts earlier among those born in Brazil and also reaches higher levels. In the African population, you don't even begin to see manumission until the 30s, right? And it remains minimal until late in life. But in this Brazilian system, by late in life, the proportions free has started to rise to levels that are comparable to the Brazilian-born population. Now, what I wanted to focus on is the next slide. So think about how this manifests itself. So I said that 60% of the enslaved population were Africans, not born in Africa. But remember that the Brazilian-born then are dominating in childhood. So this chart on the left shows you what proportion of the enslaved population were Africans. And the point that I want to focus on is among the adults, like almost 80% of the population are Africans. So if you wanted to be 60% overall, given that so many of the Brazilian-born are children, the proportion among adults is even higher, right? So 80% of the adult population were enslaved Africans. And then look at the chart on the right, which shows if you looked only at the freed and looked at what proportion were African as opposed to born in Brazil, you find that the Africans are almost invisible, right, until late in life when they suddenly start to appear, right, as manumission begins to operate in that population. And they only really represent a significant proportion in the very highest age category. So we know the scale of the transatlantic slave trade because we have so much independent evidence for it. We have evidence for the trade itself, and we have good documentation for the enslaved population. But imagine if this was the only evidence we had for the transatlantic slave trade. Imagine if the only evidence we had for the presence of Africans in this Brazilian province were the composition of the freed population. And I think that's the situation we have with Rome, that we don't see the enslaved population, but we do see the freed population. And we only see the foreign part of it as it becomes visible in it later in life. And we only see it indirectly because we can't see the difference between those born in Rome and those born abroad. We only see how their presence changes the onomastic pattern of the whole. So I'm coming back to this chart, which I'm going to leave up because I think it's important, but I think it takes some time to think about. So I think it turns out that Tenny Frank, despite his odious politics, was right on one count, right? That there is a connection between names and origins after all. It's just not the simplistic one that he envisaged. So we can't use names to identify the origins of particular people, and we certainly can't link a name to an origin in the East. Instead, the only way we can see these people and their origins is by taking a different perspective, which I think of as a statistical one. It's only by looking at the population as a whole. We see these people not as individuals, but as a group, and only by how their presence kind of changes the onomastic pattern of the group as a whole. But I do think this is the most important evidence we have for the scale of the trafficking human beings to Rome, right? And it shows that it must have operated on a vastly larger scale than the new minimalism suggests, and that Renz Takoma sort of took for granted in his book on mobility. This suggests, right, that at least 2/3, kind of 80% of the adult enslaved population of Rome can't have been born in Rome. Now, unfortunately, we can't do better than that. We don't know where they came from, right? And those who were not born in Rome, presumably some of them might have been enslaved at birth elsewhere in the empire and had been trafficked to Rome. We should assume a substantial internal slave trade. one of the hubs of which must have been the city of Rome because of its concentration of wealth. So there must have been people trafficked from elsewhere in Italy or the provinces to Rome. And then some of them may have been people who were born free, but enslaved by slavers within the empire or outside it or in warfare. But one way or another, I think this chart is the most important evidence we have for the scale of that traffic. Thanks.
I'm sorry to go call and take it after the previous one. You were saying that the names that are not non-Latin are essentially
Yes, let me go back. It's so common that, in fact, a lot of the scholarship treats Greek and non-Latin almost as synonyms. This is the most useful example. So Lean distinguishes between Greek and what he calls barbarian, right, which is a very kind of Hellenic perspective. So barbarian is any name with a linguistic origin that is neither Latin nor Greek. And interestingly, so what's interesting in the Western provinces, all the non-Latin names are actually Greek. Whereas in the Greek world, or sorry, in people originating in the East, we do find some names that are not Latin and not Greek either, right? So they might be Hebrew or Iranian in origin. But those proportions are very, very small. Like the vast majority of people who don't have a Latin name actually have a name that's of Greek linguistic origin.
The software, what we are seeing is preferential treatment for certain classes of people when it comes to regulation. So you would expect some proportion of people coming from across the aisle, and you wouldn't expect them to have names that sound Greek in that
Yeah, so I think it seems, right, that names were imposed on the enslaved by their owners or as part of the slave trade. And it seems that, I mean, if you look at the number of people with Greek names originating in the West, clearly Greek names were imposed on people born in the West. So many of the Germans who ended up in the city of Rome might have been given a Latin or a Greek name. So I think that's certainly the case. So you talk about the preferential treatment of people. When I was thinking about what might explain this chart, that was one of the things I thought about, is whether just people with Latin names might be more likely to be manumitted than people with non-Latin names. But what tells against that is the shape of this curve, which is really sort of level for a little bit and then it ticks up, right? So it seems to be constant through birth in a way that matches the onomastic pattern of those born in Rome, right? So that's why I actually think that what we're seeing is a difference between those who are in Rome from birth and those outside it, rather than just a simple distinction between people with Latin names and those without. Because it's a priori plausible that perhaps slave owners gave Latin names perhaps to children, of favored slaves or children that they expected to have a favored relationship with, and that those people would go on to be freed more likely. But if that were the case, you'd expect you wouldn't find the flat beginning to this chart. So I think the difference is between those born in Rome and those outside it. But that's where refining this chart by quadrupling the number of names might help to confirm that it's got a sort of a hockey stick shape rather than being an upwards curving line. Yeah, so there are lots of explanations given. I think the most common one is that this was a group for whom commemorating their freed status was most important, right? In that to survive to this corpus, one had to, you or your kin had to have invested in a stone epitaph. Lots of people were commemorated in more ephemeral forms, right, with painted epitaphs in the columbaria or something wood or paper. And one can, one can plausibly see why that the investment of a stone epitaph might have been more valuable to the freed than for the freeborn because they had something to commemorate. And I think that would be the prevailing explanation. I personally think the answer has to be even more complicated because this corpus, I've been talking about the epitaphs as a corpus, but it's very heterogeneous in that they come from monuments of very different types, right? So you have the columbaria, which were built by large households and have a lot of the people who are both enslaved and freed in them. You have smaller family tombs, and then you have individual burials. But one of the interesting things is the family tombs. So from the middle of the 1st century on, like the form of tomb most likely to preserve these epitaphs would be like a family, like a house-shaped tomb that is dedicated to the patriarch of the house, and the tomb will be for himself, his wife, and his children, and their freed men and freed women, right? So there's a very common formula in the Latin epitaph that they're dedicating this building for themselves, for their descendants, and for their liberti and libertae. So part of it, I think, is also that for the middling ranks of the wealthy, one of the ways you displayed your wealth was by providing a burial monument for your freed people. I think it's not just the freed who are choosing to commemorate themselves, but that for the wealthy, providing for the commemoration of their freed people is important. But it's very significant that it's only their freed people, not the enslaved people. Most of these households are only for themselves, their kin, and their freed men and women. But so I think it's a complex, what we have is a complex of different kinds of monuments. And those practices together are leading to the overrepresentation of the freed.
Way that it's not destroyed more if we introduce chronological parameters. That we found all the epitaphs that have a name of death, name of death, name, and we can say the approximately. With the shape of this change, conventional wisdom of human trafficking in the Roman world developed mostly sense in the early first 50 years. First century. I think we see a pattern of this
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's something I have been wondering about. One of the problems is it's in general quite difficult to date Roman epitaphs, but on my to-do list, so the CIL has a particular way of grouping epitaphs, right? So the epitaphs kind of presented themselves sort of willy-nilly, but then the editors of the CIL divided them into groups, right? So we have the magistrates first, then we have the soldiers, and then we have what they call the officiales, right, which are just men who have a profession. And so all the epitaphs that happen to mention a profession are kind of gathered together, which gives a slightly misleading impression, right? Because you then think that this is a particular social group, whereas it's actually just a detail that happens to be mentioned. But the next category are the columbaria, right? So epitaphs that certainly came from one of the columbaria, which were a particular architectural form that seems like it was very short-lived. It was in the late Republic and early Empire that the great households of Rome, or they're the freed and enslaved people in them, built these very large structures in which both the enslaved and the freed were buried. And they give way in the later 1st century to smaller tombs. So I think what we could do, and what I want to do, is to do this chart first for the columbaria inscriptions, which are mostly going to be early 1st century, and then compare that to the miscellaneous epitaphs which come later, which will be both 1st century and later. And if you're right, then you might find a difference in the earlier ones, but I haven't had a chance to do that yet.
And on whether kind of employment that was more conducive to was one day thing that for specialized players would be probably more exposed to. And more nice to be in an interest some moment of it. And also in the imperial players that is very important. That project may have information with ethnic background. To look back to the early part. Typical feature in classes, families, would be explained sometime that teacher now more skills than the other skills. So I wonder whether there is any evidence from other sources that may help to understand whether there is a connection between protection, and livelihood.
Yeah, so that's actually, I stumbled across this while trying to answer that question, in that my main focus still is actually trying to understand sort of the scale and impact of manumission in the Roman world. And I was wondering if we could use epitaphs to get a sense of the scale of manumission, right? And so the short answer is not obviously, but I am trying, and it would be a long story to give the full answer. But interesting, so I wasn't able to use age at death to illuminate manumission, but then in doing so, I stumbled across this, which perplexed me. And then I decided, well, maybe it was evidence of something different. So no, so we don't have clear evidence for the scale, nor do we for the correlation between ethnicity, occupation, and manumission, though it seems obvious that there would have been one. But we are sort of prisoners of the genre of the epitaph, or what Romans choose to put in epitaphs, right? And epitaphs are very minimal as compositions. And interestingly, one of the things they don't mention is occupation, right? So apart from the officiales, this short section at the beginning of CIL, where you get the people who do have an occupation, I think that's well under 10% of people. Most people don't choose to put their occupation on their epitaph, which means one can't then find a correlation between epitaphs and occupation. But I think that is also important for thinking about origin, right? So the fact that occupation isn't common on epitaphs, I take it, doesn't mean that occupation wasn't important to people's identity, right? Or labor wasn't important to their identity. It just wasn't appropriate for the epitaph. And so I'd say the same, we should have the same reservation about origins, right? So the fact that people don't talk about their origins in epitaphs doesn't mean that wasn't important to them or their identity. It's just that wasn't appropriate for epitaphs. Epitaphs, what mattered for them was primarily relationships. It's your name, your relationship to your kin. And interestingly, I think freedom, right? Because the fact that almost everybody who could have been free is named in a way that makes their freedom certain seems to suggest that freedom was important. But occupation wasn't, in a way that makes it difficult for us to explore those questions further. Yeah. Well, I think those must be kind of analogous phenomena, right? And that's one of the ways one maybe performs one's learning by giving sort of clever sort of Latin or Greek names to the enslaved. And that, so in Rome, certainly in the late Republic, Greek culture is valued, but it's also seen as different or distinct, as something to be consumed, right? And so I do think that's why all of these people, whatever their origins, right, including people born in Spain, even in Germany, right, are given Greek names. It's just it's what part of a package by which these people are consuming Greek culture in different forms. But I do think you're right that there is this very interesting parallel with the sort of the display of classical knowledge through the imposition of Latin names on the enslaved in the USA. Martin.
Not with their natural. And this is not the empire. So afraid that whoever rename them either because they might sell better or just because they have a name in the language. That is possible. The name has their own.
It's certainly possible because frankly we don't know, right, the circumstances under which these names were imposed. Like we do have some late antique texts that talk about naming as one of the things that one does when one inquires an enslaved person, right? Then it's a display of control. But that doesn't necessarily mean that every enslaver who ever purchased a slave imposed a name on them, right? It may well have been that the name was imposed on them as part of the slave trade or when they were trafficked. It's even conceivable that some of these people were named by their parents, right? And that the enslaver sort of participated in that. But the huge predominance of Greek names among people who don't originate in the West does seem to suggest that this is being imposed upon them by this system, right? But I agree with you that that could as well be the traffickers who are doing this as the end users. But it is, we can only speculate as to the agency responsible for imposing those names. Yeah, thanks for your patience with all the numbers.